a mother and daughter who shared the same slave lover. And what he did to them shocked everyone, but not for the reasons you'd expect. This isn't a story about a man's cruelty. It's a story about two women so desperate to be seen, so hungry to matter, that they were willing to destroy everything, including each other, for the attention of someone who saw them as nothing more than objects to exploit. What happened between Margaret, Sophie, and Marcus reveals a devastating truth. The real destruction wasn't what he did to them. It was what they did to themselves. Margaret Chen stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her bedroom, and she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. 52 years old, blonde hair perfectly highlighted, skin maintained by the best dermatologist money could buy, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And yet, despite all of it, despite the wealth, the status, the perfect appearance, she felt completely invisible. 28 years. That's how long Margaret had been married to Richard Chen, one of the most successful real estate developers in the state. 28 years of being the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect companion. She learned early on that her job wasn't to have opinions or desires of her own. Her job was to anticipate her husband's needs, to manage their social calendar, to raise their daughter with grace and discipline, and to maintain the appearance of a woman who had it all figured out. But here's the thing about being perfect. Nobody actually sees you. Richard didn't see her. He saw the role she played. Her friends didn't see her. They saw the envy-inducing lifestyle she projected. Even her own daughter didn't really see her. Sophie saw only the constraints, the expectations, the rigid framework of their family structure that she was desperate to escape. Margaret had become so skilled at disappearing into her roles that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be a real person, to have desires, to have needs, to matter in a way that wasn't contingent on what she could do for someone else. She lived in a sprawling estate in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. Every room was designer decorated. Every corner of the property was maintained to perfection by a staff of people whose names she sometimes forgot. The garden was particularly stunning, lush, manicured, a showpiece that Richard loved to point out to his business associates. And that's where she first saw him. Marcus arrived on a Tuesday in early spring. He was hired as the new groundskeeper, replacing the elderly man who retired after 40 years of service. Margaret first noticed him from the kitchen window while she was pretending to review the week's meal plan with a chef and other tasks that required her presence but not her actual engagement. He was different from the other staff members. Most of them moved through the property with their heads down, invisible in their own way, making sure not to disrupt the careful choreography of the Chen household. But Marcus moved with intention. He didn't rush. He didn't try to be invisible. He simply existed in the space as though he had every right to be there. Margaret watched him work in the garden for 3 weeks before she spoke to him directly. 3 weeks of stealing glances from windows. 3 weeks of finding excuses to walk past the garden. 3 weeks of feeling something she hadn't felt in decades: curiosity, anticipation, the electricity of possibility. When she finally approached him, she told herself it was to discuss some minor landscaping change. In reality, she just wanted to be near him. "The roses need more shade," she said, approaching him as he was pruning the hedges. "The afternoon sun is too intense in summer." He looked up from his work, and for the first time someone looked directly at her. Not at her dress, not at her jewelry, not at her role as the lady of the house. At her. "You were right," he said simply. "Was thinking the same thing. We could relocate them to the east side. The morning light there is softer." They talked about plants for 15 minutes, and in those 15 minutes, Margaret experienced something that felt like resurrection. He asked her opinion. He listened to her answers. He treated her like her thoughts mattered. Sophie Chen watched this interaction from her bedroom window with a mixture of confusion and contempt. She was 24, brilliant, beautiful, and absolutely suffocating under the weight of her mother's expectations. Where her mother had learned to accept, Sophie had learned to rebel. Where her mother had learned to diminish herself, Sophie had learned to demand space. But her rebellion had a problem. It was entirely defined in opposition to her mother's compliance. She existed only in reaction to Margaret's erasure, Sophie had spent her entire life watching her mother shrink, watching her apologize for having thoughts, watching her prioritize her husband's comfort above her own existence. And Sophie had sworn she would never be like that. She would never disappear. She would never allow herself to be reduced to a supporting character in someone else's narrative. But swearing you one T become your mother, and actually not becoming your mother are two very different things. Sophie had dropped out of graduate school not because she didn't want to continue, but because her mother thought it was a good idea, and Sophie's entire identity was built around doing the opposite of what her mother wanted. She moved back into the family home not because she wanted to, but because it was the place where her mother's shadow loomed largest, and Sophie needed that contrast to feel real. She watched her mother approach the groundskeeper with genuine curiosity, and something shifted in her. For the first time, she saw her mother not as a cautionary tale, but as a woman, and that terrified her. Margaret began to find reasons to be in the garden. She'd take her coffee outside in the mornings, settling on the stone bench that overlooked the rose beds. She'd suggest renovations to the landscape that required lengthy consultations. She'd linger in the garden in the evenings, ostensibly for fresh air, but really to have a few moments of genuine conversation with the only person in her life who seemed to see her as a real human being. For the first time in 28 years, Margaret felt alive. Sophie noticed the change in her mother immediately. She noticed how Margaret started taking more care with her appearance, not the obsessive maintenance she'd always done, but something different, something infused with actual intention. She noticed how her mother smiled more, how she laughed more, how she seemed less like a ghost haunting her own home. And Sophie hated it not because she was concerned for her mother, not because she feared her mother was making a mistake. Sophie hated it because watching her mother come alive made her own rebellion feel hollow. If her mother could find something like joy, then Sophie's rejection of her mother's life choices seemed less like principled rebellion and more like adolescent posturing. So Sophie did what anyone with a fragile sense of self would do. She decided she needed to take what her mother had found one afternoon. When Marcus was working in the garden alone, Sophie came out with a glass of water. She was wearing a sundress that showed off her youth, her beauty, her vitality. She was everything her mother was in tea, young, unencumbered, unmarked by decades of compromise. "You look like you could use this," she said, handing him the water with a smile that was deliberately calculated to be disarming. Marcus accepted the water and thanked her. He was polite, distant, professional. But Sophie was undeterred. She had spent 24 years learning how to get what she wanted by being the opposite of her mother. And what she wanted now was to prove that she could have something her mother had. She wanted to prove that she was more desirable, more interesting, more worth seeing than the woman who'd given birth to her. What neither woman understood in these early moments was that they were already trapped. Margaret was trapped in the fantasy that Marcus represented, a fantasy of being seen, of being valued, of being real. She had constructed an entire narrative around him, that he was her escape, her salvation, her proof that she was more than the role she'd been playing. Sophie was trapped in her rebellion. She needed to prove her independence by taking what her mother wanted. She needed to prove her superiority by being chosen over her mother. She needed Marcus to prefer her, not because she actually wanted him, but because being chosen by him would confirm that she was more worthy of attention than the woman who spent her entire life disappearing. And Marcus? He was watching both of them with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what he was dealing with. He'd done this before. He understood the architecture of female desperation. He understood how to position himself as the solution to a problem neither woman could quite articulate. He understood that Margaret was so starved for genuine human connection that even the smallest act of attention would register as profound love. He understood that Sophie was so desperate to define herself through opposition that she would pursue anything her mother desired, mistaking possession for power. He understood with surgical precision exactly how to exploit the fault lines in their relationship, the resentment, the invisibility, the desperation for validation. But neither Margaret nor Sophie could see any of this yet. They were too caught up in their own internal narratives. They were too focused on what they thought they were gaining to notice what they were actually losing. But what neither Margaret nor Sophie realized was that Marcus had done this before, and he was far better at this game than either of them could possibly imagine. Marcus was patient. That was his greatest weapon. While Margaret threw herself at him with the desperation of a drowning woman, and Sophie attacked with the aggression of someone trying to prove a point, Marcus simply waited. He understood something fundamental about human nature. People want to be seduced. They want to seduce themselves. They want to believe that their desires are their own, that their choices are freely made, that they are in control. So Marcus gave them the illusion of control while systematically dismantling their ability to think clearly. He started with Margaret, but not in the way she expected. He didn't make grand romantic gestures. He didn't confess feelings or promise her a future. Instead, he asked her questions. Real questions. Questions that made her think about herself in ways she hadn't in decades. "What would you do?" he asked one afternoon while they were supposedly discussing the garden layout, "if nobody was watching? If you didn't have to be perfect for anyone?" Margaret froze. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread through every part of her consciousness. What would she do? She honestly didn't know. The concept of doing anything purely for herself, without it being in service of some role or obligation, felt almost transgressive. "I don't know," she admitted, and there was something in that admission, something vulnerable and real, that made Marcus look at her differently, or at least, it made her believe he was looking at her differently. "You should figure that out," he said softly. "You deserve to know what you want." The sentence was simple, innocuous even. But to Margaret it felt like an act of revolution. Someone was telling her that her desires mattered, that she deserved things, that her wants weren't selfish or frivolous but legitimate and worthy of pursuit. She was falling in love with the idea of being seen so completely that she failed to notice she was being manipulated. Meanwhile, Sophie was watching this dynamic unfold, and it was driving her absolutely insane. Her mother was glowing. Her mother, the woman Sophie had spent her entire adult life despising for her complicity, her passivity, her willingness to disappear, was suddenly animated and alive and happy. And Sophie couldn't stand it. The irony, of course, was that Sophie's resentment of her mother's newfound happiness was itself a form of the same erasure her mother had experienced her whole life. Sophie couldn't celebrate her mother's joy because doing so would require acknowledging that her mother had an inner life worthy of attention. It would require treating her mother as a full human being rather than as a cautionary tale or an antagonist in Sophie's personal narrative. So instead, Sophie doubled down on her pursuit of Marcus. She started engineering reasons to be alone with him. She'd volunteer to help with the landscaping, then complain about the heat and suggest they take a break in the shade. She'd time her garden walks to coincide with his work schedule. She'd wear clothes that were progressively more revealing, more carefully selected to draw his attention. And Marcus, with the patience of a chess master, began playing her with equal precision. With Sophie, he didn't ask philosophical questions. Instead, he treated her like an adult. He talked to her about real things, not gardening, but ideas. He asked her opinion on books and films and current events. He listened to her thoughts as though they were genuinely interesting to him. He treated her like her intelligence mattered. To Sophie, who had spent her entire life rebelling against a mother who underestimated her, being intellectually validated felt like being chosen. It felt like being seen. "Most people your age just want to party," Marcus told her one evening when they were alone in the garden. "But you read different. You actually think about things. You actually care about ideas." Sophie's heart soared. Here was someone acknowledging what she always believed about herself, that she was smarter than her peers, more sophisticated, more intellectually advanced. He was confirming her own estimation of herself, which was exactly what she needed in that moment. What she didn't understand was that he was also exploiting her insecurity. He was flattering the very parts of her that her mother had never acknowledged, thereby creating a sense of obligation toward him. He was making her feel special and unique in precisely the way that made her willing to do whatever he asked. Neither woman realized that Marcus was operating from a playbook he refined through years of practice. He understood that women who felt unseen were the most vulnerable. Women who had been erased by their own families, their own circumstances, their own internalized beliefs about their worth. Those women were hungry, desperate, willing to believe almost anything if it came packaged with attention and validation. Margaret was hungry for emotional connection. She'd been starved of it for so long that even the basic acknowledgement of her existence felt like love. Marcus gave her that. He listened to her. He asked about her thoughts. He made space for her in conversations. And in doing so, he created a dependency. Sophie was hungry for intellectual validation. She deconstructed her entire identity around being smarter, more thoughtful, more interesting than her mother. Marcus gave her that. He treated her ideas as if they mattered. He engaged with her thoughts as though she was his equal, and in doing so, he created a different kind of dependency rooted in the need to be perceived as exceptional. The dangerous part was that both women were beginning to interpret this attention as love. They were conflating being listened to with being loved. They were mistaking validation for devotion, and Marcus was carefully cultivating that confusion. One evening, Margaret found a note in the garden. It was tucked under a stone near the roses, written in handwriting that was carefully neutral, neither too formal nor too familiar. You braver than you think you are. I can see it when you here in the garden. The real you, not the version you show the world. That's the person I want to know. Margaret's hands shook as she read it. She read it again and again. She memorized it. She analyzed every word for hidden meaning. Was this a confession, a promise, an invitation? It was none of those things, and it was all of those things, depending on what Margaret needed it to be. And that was precisely the point. At almost the same moment, Sophie received a text message. It came from a burner phone number she didn't recognize, but the content left no doubt about who it was from. You were the most interesting person I've ever met in a long time. I find myself thinking about our conversations more than I probably should. I know this is complicated, but I wanted you to know that what we're rebuilding feels different from anything else. Sophie stared at the message for hours. She read it over and over. She analyzed the word choice. Building suggested something intentional, something planned, something real. Different suggested that he felt something unique with her. Thinking about our conversations suggested that she occupied space in his mind even when they weren't together. She was being set up. They both were. But the setup was so perfectly calibrated to their individual vulnerabilities that neither of them could see it. Margaret began to believe that Marcus truly saw her in a way that no one else ever had. She began to interpret his attention as proof that she was worthy of love. She began to see him as the key to unlocking the real version of herself that had been locked away all these years. Sophie began to believe that Marcus recognized her as a peer, as an intellectual equal, as someone exceptional and rare. She began to interpret his validation as proof that she was special, that she wasn't like other women her age, that she mattered in a way that transcended the normal hierarchies of attraction and desire. And Marcus, watching both women become increasingly intoxicated by his attention, knew that the next phase was about to begin. The phase where he would stop being the solution to their problems and would instead become the instrument of their mutual destruction. But first, he needed to make sure they fully understood that they were competing for him. He needed to make sure they saw each other not as a mother and daughter, but as rivals. He needed to create a situation where their relationship to him became more important than their relationship to each other. The garden, which had started as the site of Margaret's small resurrection, was about to become the battleground where both women would fight for the crumbs of attention Marcus was willing to drop at their feet. And the worst part? Neither of them saw it coming. The turning point came on a Friday afternoon in late May. Margaret had scheduled what she believed was a private consultation with Marcus about redesigning the rose garden. She spent the morning selecting the right outfit, reviewing landscape design concepts, rehearsing the conversation in her mind so it would feel natural and unforced. What she didn't know was that Sophie had texted Marcus earlier that morning, asking if he could help her move some heavy planters she wanted to rearrange in her section of the garden. When Margaret arrived at the garden with her carefully curated mood boards and design sketches, she found Marcus already working alongside Sophie. They were laughing about something, genuinely laughing, heads close together as they lifted a large terracotta planter. The sight hit Margaret like a physical blow. Sophie saw her mother's face change the moment the carefully constructed confidence crumbled and something dark and satisfying bloomed in her chest. This was it. This was the moment she'd been unconsciously working toward. Her mother's pain was proof that Sophie had won, that Sophie was more desirable, more worthy of attention, more real in Marcus's eyes. "Oh, Mom," Sophie said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We're almost done here. Just help us with this last one, would you?" The casual dismissal was deliberate. The suggestion that Margaret was merely help, a utility to be deployed when needed, rather than the center of Marcus's attention. It was a power play disguised as a request. Margaret felt the humiliation wash over her. She wanted to leave. She wanted to turn around and walk back into the house and pretend this hadn't happened. But she couldn't, because leaving would mean admitting that she cared, that she was hurt, that this mattered to her. So she stayed. She helped move the planter. She made small talk that felt like swallowing glass, and the entire time she watched her daughter and the man she was increasingly convinced she was in love with move together with an ease and familiarity that suggested something had shifted. That evening, Margaret called Marcus. She used the gardening excuse there was something wrong with the irrigation system. Could he come look at it in the morning? But what she was really doing was securing his attention. She was reasserting her claim. He agreed to come early, before Sophie would be awake. When he arrived at 6:30 a.m., Margaret was waiting with coffee and fresh pastries. She'd woken at 5 to shower and do her hair and makeup. She wanted to show him that she was put together, sophisticated, worth his time. She wanted to prove that she was more than just a desperate older woman. They walked through the garden as the sun came up, and Marcus was attentive in a way that made Margaret feel like the center of his universe. He complimented her eye for design. He asked her questions about what she wanted the garden to become. He made her feel like her vision mattered. "You have good instincts," he told her, standing close enough that she could smell the detergent on his clothes. "Most people just do what they think they're supposed to do, but you actually think about what you want." It was the same type of validation he gave to Sophie, just packaged differently, and Margaret, who was starving for this kind of attention, accepted it as gospel. Meanwhile, Sophie was awake. She heard his truck pull up the driveway. She waited in her bedroom, listening to the sound of their voices carrying through the garden, growing increasingly angry with each passing minute. By the time she finally appeared on the patio in her carefully chosen summer dress, she was barely containing her rage. "Marcus," she called out, "I was hoping I'd catch you. I wanted to ask your advice about something I've been thinking about." It was transparent, obvious, a blatant attempt to reclaim his attention, but Marcus welcomed it, because now the competition was explicit. Now both women understood that they were fighting for the same thing, and that was exactly what he wanted. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic became increasingly toxic. Margaret would find reasons to be in the garden when she knew Marcus was working. Sophie would appear moments later with some manufactured need. They would circle each other like predators, each trying to pull Marcus's attention, each trying to prove that they were more worthy of his time. Richard, Margaret's husband, began to notice that something was wrong. His wife was distant, distracted. She was spending more time on her appearance, but in a way that felt unfamiliar, less about maintaining the image of perfection and more about what? He couldn't quite identify it. But it unsettled him. He called her out about it once, in the careful, controlled way that characterized their entire relationship. "You seem different lately," he said. "Is everything okay?" Margaret wanted to tell him the truth. She wanted to say, "I'm awakening to the fact that I've been dead for 28 years. I'm discovering what it feels like to be seen. I am experiencing desire and anticipation and the electricity of feeling alive." Instead, she said, "Everything's fine, just tired." He accepted the lie because accepting it was easier than engaging with whatever truth she might have been trying to tell him. Sophie, meanwhile, was experiencing her own form of crisis. The attention she was receiving from Marcus was intoxicating, but it was also making her realize something uncomfortable. She didn't actually want him. What she wanted was to win. What she wanted was to prove her superiority over her mother. What she wanted was to feel powerful in a way that had nothing to do with Marcus himself and everything to do with taking something from her mother. But acknowledging that would mean acknowledging that she was just as desperate, just as hungry for validation, just as willing to sacrifice her integrity for the feeling of being chosen. It would mean admitting that she was no better than her mother. It would mean giving up the narrative she deconstructed about being different, being stronger, being above the need for male validation. So instead of facing that realization, Sophie doubled down. She became more aggressive in her pursuit of Marcus. She started staying out late with him, coming home with stories about conversations they'd had, books they'd discussed, places they'd gone. Together, she made sure her mother knew about every interaction. Margaret responded by becoming increasingly erratic. She would snap at Sophie over nothing. She would spend hours in the garden waiting for Marcus, then feel crushed when he didn't appear. She would scrutinize every text message from him, reading hidden meanings into neutral words. The invisible thread that had always connected Margaret and Sophie, thread of mother-daughter obligation, was being replaced by something far more destructive, the thread of competition. And Marcus was pulling both ends, tightening the noose around their necks. What neither woman understood was that this competition was exactly what he orchestrated from the beginning. He identified the fault lines in their relationship and systematically widened them. He used Margaret S. invisibility and Sophie S. rebellion as tools to turn them against each other. And the most devastating part? Neither of them could stop. Because stopping would mean admitting that they'd been manipulated. It would mean accepting that their desperation had made them blind. It would mean facing the reality that the thing they thought they were fighting for, his love, his attention, his validation, had never been real in the first place. They were trapped in a competition with no finish line, fighting for a prize that would ultimately destroy them both. By the middle of June, the household had become a pressure cooker. The air was thick with tension that no one explicitly acknowledged, but everyone felt. Richard sensed something was wrong, but lacked the emotional vocabulary to address it. The household staff moved carefully around Margaret and Sophie, sensing the hostility that crackled between them like exposed electrical wires. Margaret had stopped pretending to maintain the facade of normalcy. She was obsessed, completely, utterly obsessed. She would check her phone hundreds of times a day, waiting for messages from Marcus. She would time her movements through the house to coincide with when she knew he'd be working in the garden. She lost weight not intentionally, but because she'd forgotten to eat. Her carefully maintained appearance had become something else entirely, a weapon she was forging to win a war she didn't understand. One afternoon she found a photograph. It was on Sophie's desk, tucked under a textbook. Marcus and Sophie, standing together in the garden at dusk, his arm around her shoulders. They were both smiling. They both looked happy. Margaret stared at that photograph for 20 minutes. She couldn't look away. She couldn't process what she was seeing. In her mind, she and Marcus had something special, something real, something that couldn't be replicated or replaced. But this photograph suggested otherwise. This photograph suggested that he could be happy with Sophie in the exact same way. She made a decision in that moment, a decision that would echo through the rest of her life. She went to Sophie's room and confronted her. "What is this?" she demanded, holding up the photograph. Sophie was lying on her bed, reading. She sat up slowly, taking in her mother's flushed face, her trembling hands, her barely contained rage. "It's a photograph," Sophie said coolly. "I'm sure you know what those are. How long has this been going on?" Margaret's voice was getting louder. "How long have you been with him?" Sophie stood up, and for the first time she didn't hide behind sarcasm or deflection. She let her mother see the truth. "Does it matter?" Sophie asked. "He's not yours, Mom. He was never yours. You were having a fantasy. You were a middle-aged woman having a midlife crisis, and you were mistaking attention from a man 10 years younger for love." The words were cruel, deliberately, precisely cruel. They were designed to land exactly where they would hurt most, and they did. Margaret felt something break inside her. Not metaphorically. Actually break. It was like watching a dam fail all the emotions she'd been containing, all the hope she'd been nurturing, All the beliefs she deconstructed around Marcus suddenly came crashing down. "You did this on purpose," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. "You saw that I was happy, and you had to destroy it. You had to take it from me." "I didn't have to do anything," Sophie snapped back. "You made yourself vulnerable. You threw yourself at a man you don't even know. And now you're trying to make it my fault that he preferred me?" The words hung in the air between them. And in that moment, something shifted in both women. Because Sophie had just revealed the truth that neither of them had been willing to face, this was never about Marcus at all. This was about validation. This was about proving worth. This was about the desperate hunger that came from never feeling seen by the people who were supposed to see you. Sophie was desperate to prove she was better than her mother. Margaret was desperate to prove she was worthy of being loved. And Marcus had simply held up a mirror to those desperations and watched them destroy themselves. Margaret left Sophie's room without another word. She went downstairs to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of wine, then another, then another. By the time Richard came home from work, she was sitting in the living room in the dark, completely intoxicated, the photograph still clutched in her hand. He found her like that and asked what was wrong. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to confess that she'd been having an affair or something like an affair, something undefined and murky with the groundskeeper. She wanted to tell him that their entire marriage had been a performance and that she'd finally discovered what it felt like to be real, and it had destroyed her. Instead, she said, "I think I need help. I think something is wrong with me." Richard's response was to call their family doctor and schedule an appointment. He assumed she was having some kind of medical crisis. He couldn't have comprehended that what was actually happening was an existential one. Sophie, meanwhile, was having her own reckoning. She went to find Marcus in the garden that evening. She needed to understand what was happening. She needed him to clarify his feelings. She needed him to tell her that what he said to her actually meant something. She found him tending to the roses, and she walked right up to him and asked, "Do you love me?" Marcus didn't even pause his work. He just kept pruning, kept moving methodically through the plants. "What do you think?" he asked, without looking at her. I'm asking you," Sophie said, her voice getting sharper. "I need you to tell me clearly. Do you love me, or do you love my mother?" Marcus finally looked at her. And in his eyes, Sophie saw something that made her blood run cold. She saw apathy. Complete, total apathy. She saw someone looking at her the way you look at a plant with mild interest, but no real investment. "I don't love either of you," he said simply. "I like you both. You were both interesting in your own ways. But love? No." The honesty should have been a relief. It should have been clarifying. It should have shattered the fantasy and allowed Sophie to walk away. Instead, it devastated her in a way that being lied to never could have. Because if he didn't love her, then what had all of this been about? What did his attention mean? What did his validation signify? If he wasn't in love with her, then why had she let herself believe he was? The answer was simple and terrible, because she was willing to believe anything if it came packaged with attention from someone who seemed to see her. That night, Sophie sat in her room and realized something that would take her years to fully process. She had become her mother. Not in the way she'd feared, not by accepting and disappearing, but in a way that was perhaps more tragic, by building her entire sense of self around the validation of a man who didn't actually care about her. She had fought so hard to be different from her mother that she'd become exactly like her, just with different tactics, different disguises, different stories she told herself about why she was superior. Meanwhile, Margaret was in her own room staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how she'd come to this place, how she'd gone from invisible to obsessed, how she'd allowed herself to believe that one person's attention could redeem 28 years of erasure. She'd been so desperate to feel real that she'd made herself unreal. She'd been so hungry for someone to see her that she'd abandoned her own ability to see herself. And now, sitting in the dark with the weight of her own desperation crushing down on her, she had to face a question that terrified her. Who was she without Marcus? Who was she without the fantasy of being loved? The answer was, she didn't know, and that was the most frightening thing of all. The next morning, Richard made a decision that would set the final dominoes in motion. He called Marcus into his office, a sleek, modern space on the second floor of the house that represented everything about Richard's world. Controlled, efficient, emotionally sterile. "I'm letting you go," Richard said without preamble. 2 weeks' notice. I'll pay you severance. Marcus didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He'd known this was coming. In fact, he'd been waiting for it. Because Richard's involvement was the final piece he needed. "Understood," Marcus said calmly. "I'll finish out the 2 weeks." What Richard didn't know was that Marcus had already made arrangements. He had a new job lined up in another state. He had a timeline planned. He had orchestrated his exit the same way he de-orchestrated everything else, with precision and foresight. But before he left, he needed to ensure maximum damage. That evening, he sent Margaret a message. It was brief, calculated, devastating. "I can keep doing this. Your husband knows something is going on. This isn't fair to either of you. I think we need to be honest about what this was. It was real for me, but I think we both know it can continue. I'm sorry." Margaret read the message and felt her world collapse. Not because she was shocked some part of her had always known this wasn't sustainable, but because the message was a rejection. A final, irrevocable rejection. He was choosing to leave. He was choosing to walk away. He was choosing not to fight for her. The message didn't say he didn't love her. It didn't say he'd been manipulating her. It said exactly what would hurt the most, that what they had was real but impossible, that he cared but not enough to stay, that she wasn't worth the complications. She spent the entire night crying. Not the kind of crying that releases emotion, but the kind that deepens it. The kind that comes from the realization that you've destroyed your life for something that was never real. Sophie received a different message. It was more personal, more tailored to her specific vulnerabilities. "You an incredible person. You deserve someone who can give you what you deserve. I can be that person. But I want you to know that knowing you, talking with you, it meant something to me. It made me feel like there are still people in the world who think deeply about life. You were special. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." It was the cruelest thing he could have sent, because it was partially true. He did think she was intelligent. He did find her interesting. But he was leaving anyway. And in leaving, he was confirming her deepest fear, that being intelligent and interesting and special wasn't enough, that there was something fundamentally wrong with her that made people leave. Sophie read the message and felt something calcify inside her. She spent her entire adult life trying to be exceptional, trying to be different, trying to be worth something. And it still wasn't enough. She was still being abandoned, still being left behind. The difference was that this time, she couldn't blame her mother. She couldn't construct a narrative where she was the victim of her mother's weakness. She could only blame herself. On Marcus's last day, neither Margaret nor Sophie acknowledged his departure. Margaret stayed in her room. Sophie went to class. She enrolled in a summer course at the university, partly as a way to get away from the house, partly as a way to reclaim the identity she'd been constructing before Marcus arrived. Richard, however, made a point of shaking Marcus's hand and thanking him for his work. He had no idea that the man he was thanking had systematically destroyed his family. He had no idea that the groundskeeper he was paying severance had orchestrated the unraveling of 28 years of carefully maintained illusion. Marcus left in the afternoon. He packed his truck, with the few possessions he had. He drove away from the estate without looking back, and in his absence, Margaret and Sophie were forced to face each other across a chasm of resentment and shame that seemed impossible to bridge. Margaret emerged from her room 3 days later. She looked different, older, hollowed out, like something essential had been extracted from her. Richard suggested she see a therapist. Margaret agreed, mostly because she didn't have the energy to resist. Sophie stopped going to her summer class. She spent her days in her room, oscillating between rage and despair. She'd been so focused on proving she was different from her mother that she hadn't noticed how similar they actually were. They were both hungry, both desperate, both willing to sacrifice their integrity for the validation of someone who didn't actually care about them. The first real conversation they had after Marcus left happened 2 weeks later, in the kitchen at midnight. Margaret couldn't sleep. She was making tea when Sophie came downstairs, also unable to sleep. They stood across from each other for a long moment without speaking. There was so much to say, and no words adequate to say it. "I'm sorry," Margaret finally said. "For everything. For not seeing you. For being so consumed with my own Dante," Sophie interrupted. "Dante, apologize. Dante, make this about you trying to be better, just Dante." They stood in silence again, and in that silence, something shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something like acknowledgement. An understanding that they had both been broken in similar ways by similar hungers. That they had both been willing to destroy their relationship with each other to fill the void inside themselves. "He's gone," Margaret said quietly. "I know," Sophie replied. "Did he ever actually care about you?" Margaret asked. Sophie considered the question. "I don't think he cared about either of us. I think he saw what we needed, and he gave us just enough of it to make us believe in something that wasn't real." Margaret nodded. She'd come to the same conclusion through her therapy sessions. Marcus had been a mirror held up to their deepest insecurities. He'd reflected back to them exactly what they needed to see to believe they were being loved. And in the process, he'd destroyed the one relationship that actually mattered. "I want to blame him," Margaret said. "I want to say he did this to us, but the truth is, I did this to myself. I was so desperate to feel seen that I ignored all the signs that something was wrong." "We both did," Sophie said. "We were both so focused on winning against each other that we didn't notice we were both losing. It wasn't healing, it wasn't resolution, but it was the beginning of something like honesty, and honesty, painful as it was, felt like the only solid ground either of them had left." Richard, meanwhile, was beginning to understand that something had happened in his household, something significant that he hadn't been present for. He noticed how Margaret moved through the days with a kind of empty precision, going through the motions of her life, but no longer inhabiting it. He noticed how Sophie had become quieter, less argumentative, less present in the ways that had defined her. He asked Margaret about it once, in his careful, controlled way. "What happened?" he asked. "Well, I wasn't paying attention. What happened to my family?" Margaret wanted to tell him the truth. She wanted to say, "I had an affair with the groundskeeper. Our daughter had an affair with the groundskeeper. And in the process, we realized that we've both been having affairs with the idea of being loved by someone, anyone, without ever questioning whether that love was real. Instead," she said, "we learned something about ourselves, and it wasn't pleasant." Richard accepted this answer, the way he accepted most things in his life, by not pressing further, by maintaining the comfortable fiction that everything was fine, as long as no one explicitly said it wasn't. But Margaret and Sophie knew better. They knew that everything had changed. They knew that they could never go back to what they'd been before. The invisible threads that had bound them, obligation, expectation, the unspoken agreement to maintain appearances, had been severed, and what remained was far more fragile and far more real. 3 months after Marcus left, Margaret was sitting in her therapist's office, a bright, minimalist space that smelled faintly of lavender and expensive candles. Dr. Chen was the kind of therapist who didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. She asked difficult questions and waited for honest responses. "Tell me about the person you were before Marcus," Dr. Chen said. Margaret had to think about this. The woman she'd been before seemed like a stranger, a ghost, someone she'd been playing rather than someone she'd been living as. "I was invisible," Margaret finally said. "I'd made myself invisible so completely that I'd forgotten I was a person. I was a role, a function, a wife, a mother, a woman who existed to serve other people's needs." "And then Marcus made you visible," Dr. Chen observed. "He made me feel visible," Margaret corrected. "But that visibility was an illusion. He was reflecting back what I needed to see, not what was actually there." This distinction mattered, because Margaret was learning that being seen and believing you being seen are two entirely different things. She believed Marcus saw her, but what he actually done was show her a mirror, and the person in that mirror wasn't reality, was a fantasy constructed from her own desperation. "What about now?" Dr. Chen asked. "Who are you now?" Margaret sat with this question for a long time. "I am someone in the process of finding out. I am someone who's angry. I am someone who's ashamed. I am someone who's beginning to understand that the only person who can actually see me is myself." Across town, Sophie was having her own reckoning. She'd gone back to her summer class, but with a different mindset. She was no longer there to prove her intellectual superiority. She was there because she genuinely wanted to learn. She also started writing, not formally, not with the intention of publishing, but as a way to process what had happened. She was documenting the entire experience, the seduction, the competition with her mother, the discovery that she'd been manipulated, the realization that her entire identity had been constructed in opposition to her mother rather than in support of herself. Her essays were raw and honest and unflinching. She wrote about her resentment toward her mother. She wrote about her hunger for validation. She wrote about how she used her intelligence as a weapon rather than as a tool for understanding. She wrote about all the ways she'd been complicit in her own destruction. One evening, she showed one of these essays to her mother. They were sitting in the garden, the same garden that had been the site of so much manipulation and heartbreak. Margaret read it slowly, carefully, taking in every word. When she finished, she looked at her daughter with an expression Sophie hadn't seen before: recognition, not judgment, not criticism. Just the simple acknowledgement of seeing another person as truth. "You understand what happened," Margaret said. "I understand what I did," Sophie corrected. "I understand that I was so desperate to be different from you that I became exactly like you, just with a different costume." "What are you going to do now?" Margaret asked. Sophie looked out at the garden, at the roses that were beginning their late summer bloom, at the carefully designed landscape that had been the backdrop for their mutual destruction. "I don't know yet," Sophie said, "but I know I don't want to spend my entire life trying to prove that I'm better than someone else. And I know I don't want to hand that power to another person. I'm going to try to figure out who I actually am, separate from what I am rebelling against." Margaret reached over and took her daughter's hand. It was the first genuine gesture of affection between them in months. And it wasn't romantic or intense or dramatic. It was just a simple acknowledgement. "I see you. I understand you. You were not alone in this." The following week, Margaret made a decision that shocked everyone, including herself. She told Richard that she wanted a separation. Not a divorce necessarily, but a separation. She needed time to figure out who she was when she wasn't performing the role of his wife. Richard's response was surprisingly measured. "I suppose I always knew something was wrong," he said. "I just didn't want to look too closely at it." "That's the problem," Margaret said gently. "You never wanted to look closely at anything. Not at me, not at Sophie, not at yourself. It was easier to maintain the illusion than to face reality." Richard didn't argue. He spent his entire life avoiding difficult truths. He wasn't going to start now. Margaret moved into a small apartment across the city. It was nothing like the estate she'd been living in. It was modest, simple, utterly unglamorous. And she loved it. Because in that apartment she wasn't performing for anyone. She wasn't trying to be the perfect wife or the perfect mother or the perfect woman. She was just Margaret, 48 years old, figuring out what she wanted. Learning to see herself. She started volunteering at a women's shelter. She listened to stories of women who were invisible in their own lives. Women who were hungry for validation, women who'd been manipulated by men who understood how to exploit that hunger. And in listening to these women, Margaret began to understand her own story differently. She wasn't a victim, but she wasn't entirely responsible either. She was a woman who'd been shaped by a culture that taught her that her worth came from other people's perception of her. She'd been shaped by a family that valued appearances over authenticity. She'd been shaped by decades of invisibility. But she was also a woman who was finally choosing to shape herself. Sophie, meanwhile, had a more dramatic transformation. She stopped going to university not because she failed or because she was giving up, but because she realized she was going there for the wrong reasons. She was going to prove something, to show someone, to be exceptional. Instead, she took a gap year. She worked at a bookstore. She traveled. She read voraciously not to prove her intelligence, but because she genuinely wanted to understand the world. She went to therapy, where she worked through her resentment toward her mother and, more importantly, her resentment toward herself. She also wrote about her experience, not as a confession or a cautionary tale, but as an examination of how easily we can be manipulated when we read desperate for validation. Her essays found their way into literary magazines. They were read by other women who recognized themselves in Sophie S. words. And slowly something remarkable happened. Sophie S. validation came not from a man or from proving her superiority, but from her own work, from her own honesty, from her own ability to see herself clearly and describe that seeing to others. The final turning point came 6 months after Marcus left. Margaret and Sophie were having lunch together, something they did regularly now, not out of obligation but out of genuine desire to spend time with each other. Sophie mentioned that she'd been contacted by a podcaster who wanted to interview her about her essays. The podcaster was interested in the story of how she'd been manipulated, how she'd manipulated herself, and how she'd eventually found her way to a more authentic understanding of who she was. "Are you going to do it?" Margaret asked. Sophie hesitated. "I don't know. Part of me wants to. Part of me is afraid that telling this story will reduce what happened to entertainment. That people will listen to it the way they listen to true crime, getting a thrill from someone else's pain rather than actually learning something." "What does your instinct tell you?" Margaret asked. "My instinct tells me that the story matters," Sophie said. "Not because it's sensational or because it involves manipulation and heartbreak, but because it's honest. Because it shows how desperately we all hunger for validation. Because it might help someone recognize the signs of manipulation before they find themselves in the same position." "Then tell the story," Margaret said. "Not for the validation it might bring you, not to prove anything to anyone, but because you believe it matters." Sophie nodded. She understood the distinction her mother was making. She understood that the difference between healthy sharing and destructive oversharing was motivation. It was the difference between sharing to help and sharing to prove. When Sophie recorded the podcast episode, she didn't sensationalize what had happened. She was honest about her own complicity. She was clear about how her hunger for validation had made her vulnerable. She talked about her mother not as a villain or a cautionary tale, but as another human being caught in the same trap. And she talked about Marcus not with anger, but with a kind of clinical detachment. She described his tactics not to demonize him, but to help others recognize manipulation when they saw it. The episode resonated with thousands of listeners. Women wrote to Sophie describing their own experiences with men who understood how to exploit their hunger for validation. They wrote about the relief they felt in recognizing themselves in someone else's story. They wrote about how the episode had helped them see their own situations more clearly. And in receiving these messages, Sophie understood something fundamental. Her pain had value not because it was dramatic or exceptional, but because it was real and relatable. Her story mattered not because it was spectacular, but because it was true. Margaret listened to the podcast episode with tears streaming down her face. Not because she was ashamed she'd worked through most of that in therapy, but because her daughter had taken the worst experience of her life and transformed it into something that could help other people. She'd taken her pain and made it mean something. That was the real payoff. Not the dramatic revelation, not the moment of confrontation, but the slow, difficult work of understanding what had happened and choosing to use that understanding to grow. Marcus, wherever he was, had moved on to his next target. There was always another woman hungry for validation. There was always another man or woman desperate to feel seen. And he would find them and exploit them, the same way he exploited Margaret and Sophie. But Margaret and Sophie had learned something that Marcus could never teach them and could never take away, that the only Validation that truly matters is the validation that comes from within, that the only person who can truly see you is yourself, and that the most powerful thing you can do is choose to see yourself clearly, honestly, completely, and decide that what you see is enough. The conclusion, what they lost and what they found. When you look back on the story of Margaret and Sophie, you might think the tragedy is that they were manipulated, that a man exploited their vulnerabilities and destroyed their relationship with each other. But the real tragedy and the real transformation is more subtle than that. The tragedy is that both women had been living lives that made them vulnerable to manipulation in the first place. Margaret had made herself invisible for so long that the moment someone paid attention to her, she believed she was being loved. Sophie had constructed an identity based entirely on being better than her mother, which meant she was always looking for external validation of her superiority. They were both dependent on other people to tell them who they were. And the transformation came when they stopped looking outward for that validation and started looking inward. Marcus's greatest power wasn't his ability to seduce them. It was his ability to recognize what they needed and to reflect it back to them. Once they understood that, his power dissolved, because they realized that the love they thought they were receiving wasn't real, it was a projection of their own needs. In losing that false love, they gained something infinitely more valuable. They gained themselves. Margaret learned that invisibility isn't strength. It's a slow form of self-erasure. And visibility, true visibility, the kind that comes from seeing yourself, is far more powerful than being seen by anyone else. Sophie learned that being exceptional isn't about proving your superiority. It's about being authentic. It's about doing work that matters to you, not work that matters because it impresses other people. And both of them learned that the person who can truly hurt you is not the person who manipulates you, but the person you allow to define who you are. The garden where this all took place is beautiful now. It's maintained by a different groundskeeper, a woman named Elena who tends it with genuine care rather than calculated manipulation. Margaret volunteers at the women's shelter 3 days a week. Sophie is finishing her degree not to prove anything, but because she actually wants to. And Richard is slowly, painfully learning what it means to actually see the people around him. As for Marcus, he's already moved on. He's already found new women hungry for validation. He's already begun the slow work of seduction and manipulation. And he'll likely succeed, because there will always be people desperate to be seen, desperate to be loved, desperate to believe that someone else can make them whole. But maybe, just maybe, some of those women will recognize the signs before it's too. Maybe they'll remember the story of Margaret and Sophie and realize that the only person who can truly save them is themselves. And that as the real ending, not the dramatic confrontation, not the moment of betrayal, but the quiet, unglamorous work of learning to see yourself, of choosing yourself, of building a life based not on what other people think of you, but on what you think of yourself. That's where the real power is. That's where the real story ends.